There are woods in Mississippi that feel friendly in the daytime. You can walk them slow, listen to the water, watch the light move through the hardwoods, and you never think twice about what's behind you. Then night comes, and it turns into a different place. The same trees, the same trails, the same creek bends, but the air changes, the quiet changes, and you start to feel like the land is paying attention. I grew up around those river-bottom woods. Hunting wasn't a special event for us. It was just what you did when the season opened. You learned the trails, learned where the hogs liked to wallow, learned where the deer crossed at first light. You learned what a normal night sounded like: two frogs, insects, owls, a constant background noise that makes you feel like you're not alone, even when you are. That is why this still gets under my skin. Because the first sign wasn't a scream in the dark or something crashing through brush. It was a feeling, a steady pressure, like someone was standing just out of sight, and the woods were making room for it. Not danger yet, just awareness. Like the place had eyes. Mississippi bottom land has smells that stick to you. Sweet rot from leaves, sharp mud, cold water, and sometimes the iron smell of old decay where something died and fed the whole chain of life. Usually those smells feel normal. This time, the smell that came and went didn't blend. It sat on top of everything, like a wet animal that had been lying in the same place for days, then stood up and moved without sound. It happened in a season when everything else should have been normal. The weather was steady. The river was down enough to move around without fighting the current. The leaves were in that late fall stage where the ground stays damp and quiet under your boots. We had hunted that area for years and never once felt uneasy beyond the usual. This time we did. When I say we, I mean a small group of experienced hunters, not kids looking to get scared, not people trying to tell a story. Folks who had spent their whole lives in these woods, who knew the difference between a hog tearing up a bank and a bear rubbing on a tree, who could hear a squirrel sneeze and know what direction it came from. The river-bottom land has a way of making distance feel longer than it is. You can walk a mile and feel like you walked 3 because you're stepping around water, weaving through cane, and crossing patches where the ground tries to pull at your boots. The air stays damp and sound carries strange. A twig snap can feel close when it's far, and sometimes a heavy step can vanish like it never happened. The plan was simple. A multi-day hunt in deep river-bottom land, away from roads and away from the weekend crowd. The kind of place where the hardwoods thicken and the swamp edges start to braid together, where the ground can go from solid to soft in 2 steps, and the air smells like wet leaves and old water. We packed light but not careless. A tent, a tarp, dry socks, enough food, a small fire kit, and what we needed to hunt. No fancy setup, no big camp. Just a familiar clearing we'd used before, tucked back from the waterline, high enough to stay dry if the level rose overnight. The first day went the way those days always go. Slow walking, pausing at sign, moving along game trails that had been there longer than any of us. We saw hog tracks in the mud and deer scat in the thinned grass. We saw where something heavy had slid down a bank. Maybe a hog, maybe a big deer. Nothing that raised a flag. In those woods, you judge distance by sound and by the way light hits the trunks. When the sound drops out, distance becomes guesswork. You can't tell if a step is 50 yards away or 100. You can't tell if the movement is in front or off to the side. That uncertainty is what makes you feel hunted, even when nothing is charging. It turns every pause into a question you can't answer. By late afternoon, we were back at the clearing. The sun was low, turning the tops of the trees gold, while the bottom land stayed dim. We got camp set the same way we always did. Fire ring where it always was. Packs hung where we could reach them. Nothing rushed, nothing tense. And then the first night came, and it felt like the woods forgot how to breathe. It wasn't the normal settling in quiet you get after sundown. It was a hard quiet, Frogs went silent near the water. Insects stopped. Even the wind, which had been moving through the tops earlier, dropped off like someone shut a door. When the fire snapped, it sounded too sharp, like a twig breaking in a small room. We all noticed it without saying much. You can feel it when a place gets too still. You start hearing your own movements, your own breathing, the little sounds your gear makes. It puts you on edge because your mind starts searching for the reason. And in those woods, the reason is usually a predator or something you don't understand. We kept the fire small, like always. Too big a fire in river bottom woods throws light a long way. It makes you visible. We ate, cleaned up, and settled down early. Not because we were scared, but because the quiet made everything feel louder than it should. We kept noticing how clean the nights were. No random rustling. No squirrel chatter. No small things making mistakes. It was like the smaller life had made room for something bigger and smarter. That idea sounds dramatic until you've heard it. Until you've sat in a clearing with a fire and realized the fire is the only thing making noise besides your own breathing. Sometime after dark, the smell came in. Not strong at first, just a thin wave that moved with no wind. Wet dog, mud, and something old and sour underneath. It passed, then came again, then faded. We checked our gear, checked our boots, checked the area around the fire. Nothing explained it. We were used to the normal discomforts. Mosquitoes when the weather warmed. Mud that grabbed at your soles. The smell of stagnant water in the low spots. We were used to the normal risks too, like slipping near a bank or stepping into a soft pocket that goes deeper than it looks. None of that scares you when you've done it your whole life. This was different because it didn't feel like nature. It felt like intent. Later, far off, there was movement. Not close enough to see. Just heavy steps in soft ground, then nothing. If it had been a hog, we would have heard the rooting. If it had been a deer, we would have heard the quick, light crunches. This sounded like weight shifting, deliberate, measured, like something big knew exactly where it was going. Nobody slept well. Not because of fear, but because the quiet wouldn't let your brain shut down. You lay there listening for the next sound, and when it doesn't come, you listen harder. Morning brought relief in the way morning always does. You can see again. You can move without imagining shapes in the dark. The sun came up weak through the trees, and the swamp mist lifted in thin layers. We made coffee and stepped out to look around. That's when we saw the first signs that made no sense. Around the edge of the clearing, the grass and low plants were pressed down in patches, like something had knelt or crouched there. Saplings were bent over, not snapped, just pushed and held long enough to take a set. It looked like a big animal had been there, but the pattern wasn't right for a hog or a deer. The mud around the sloughs held prints the way soft clay does, and it gave away weight. You could tell when something heavy stepped there, because the impression stayed even after water seeped back in. In a couple spots, we saw where the ground had bulged at the edges of a print, like the foot pressed down hard and displaced everything around it. That kind of pressure wasn't from a deer or even a big hog. There were tracks too, but the ground was soft and inconsistent. In the mud near a puddle, we found deep impressions that were too long to be a normal human boot and too narrow to be a bear paw. In other spots, we found only the edge of a print, like something had stepped lightly on ground but still sank under the weight. We didn't make a big deal out of it. People see odd tracks in the river bottoms all the time. A hog can smear its foot, a deer can slide, a man can make a print that looks strange if the mud is half dried. We told ourselves it was nothing and moved on. About mid-morning, that feeling came back. Not fear, not panic, just that steady awareness, like eyes on your back. You stop, you listen, you look, and you see nothing. Then you start moving again, and you feel it again. The odd part was how the sounds behaved. Normally, if something is following you, you hear it behind you. This wasn't like that. We would hear a small movement ahead, then see nothing when we got there. We would hear a distant branch shift to one side, then notice the same kind of shift on the other side minutes later. It felt like we were being paced, not chased. One reason the upright shape felt wrong was the stillness. Animals have small movements even when they freeze. They shift ears, they flick tails, they adjust their weight. This shape held like a post, as if it didn't need to fidget. That kind of stillness reads as confidence. It reads like intelligence. It reads like something that knows you can see it and doesn't care until it decides it's time to move. Every hunter knows the difference between being nervous and being warned. Nervous is what you feel before daylight when you can't see far. Warned is what you feel when everything alive around you goes quiet at the same time. That quiet isn't empty. It is a message passed through the woods, and you can feel it in your ribs when you stand still long enough. Birds flushed without the normal lead-up. Usually you hear the rustle first, then the wings. Here, a group of birds would lift out of the trees as if something large had stepped under them, and we hadn't heard the approach. Small animals stayed hidden. The woods felt empty in a way that didn't match the season. We found more tree damage as we moved. Bark stripped high on trunks, well above shoulder height. Not the low rub marks you see from deer. These were long scrapes, narrow but deep, like something with hard nails or rough hands had dragged down the bark from higher up. Some of the stripped spots had sap still wet around the edges. The smell came back too, stronger in pockets. Wet fur, swamp water, and that sour note like something had been laying up in damp leaves. It didn't stay steady. It rolled in and out as if it belonged to something moving through the trees where air didn't circulate. That afternoon, we noticed our usual routes were getting weird. A fallen tree lay across a trail we used all the time. Not impossible to get around, but placed in a way that forced you to step into thicker brush. Another path was choked with cane that hadn't been there the last season. It felt like the woods were nudging us, steering us away from certain spots. We kept hunting, but we started staying closer together without even saying it out loud. When people do that, they usually claim it's to keep track of each other. The truth is, you do it when you don't want to be alone. We tried to keep our heads in the hunt, but our attention kept drifting to the edges. You can't help it. The edge of vision is where danger starts. In thick woods, the edge is everywhere. Every trunk becomes a possible hiding place. Every patch of cane becomes a curtain. When you feel watched, every curtain looks like it has someone behind it. Late in the day, we got our first clear moment that pushed it past normal. We were near a tree line where the hardwoods thinned into a darker patch of swamp edge. The light was wrong there, always dimmer, like the shadows stayed longer. One of us glanced up and froze. At the edge of that dark patch, there was a tall, upright shape. It wasn't moving. It wasn't swaying like a tree trunk. It was just there, vertical and still, like it had been waiting. We couldn't make out details. The distance and the shade hid it. But the height was wrong for any person, and wrong for any animal that should be standing like that. The shape shifted once, slow, controlled. It moved without the usual noise you'd expect. No heavy crash. No snapping branches. Just a change in position. Then it slipped backward into thicker cover and disappeared. The way it vanished made it worse. Something that big should have made sound. It didn't. After that, the mood changed. Nobody said much. We didn't call it anything out loud. We just kept moving and kept scanning the woods the way you do when your brain knows more than your mouth wants to admit. The clearing we used for camp wasn't special, just practical. It sat on slightly higher ground, with enough open space to see a few yards into the tree line. The fire ring was old, stones darkened from past seasons. There were old cut marks on a stump where someone had split wood years before. It was the kind of place you don't think about twice, and that's what made the changes so hard to ignore. We decided to shorten the hunt. Not because we were convinced of anything, but because the whole day had felt off, and the river bottoms can punish you when you ignore that feeling. We turned back toward camp earlier than planned, taking the clearest route we knew. The pressed grass near camp looked like more than a path. In one place, it formed a shallow oval, like something had crouched there for a while. Not a nest made of sticks, not a bed lined with leaves, just a depression made by weight holding the plants down. That kind of mark is what you see where a person kneels to look, not where an animal passes through fast. Even on the way back, the pressure stayed. It didn't feel like we were being chased. It felt like we were being watched from the side, like something was paralleling us just out of view. Every time we stopped, the woods felt still again. Every time we moved, we caught little shifts in the brush that stopped the moment we looked. Back at camp, the clearing looked normal at first. Then we saw that some small items had been moved. Nothing valuable, nothing taken, just shifted. A piece of firewood that had been stacked neatly was on the ground. A small bag that had been hung to keep dry had been turned the other way. Little things that told you someone had been here, but not in the way a thief acts. We checked for the obvious. No raccoon mess, no torn food bag, no sign of hogs rooting through the area. It was as if something had come close, touched things, and left. Like a reminder. That second night was worse, because we went into it already tense. We did everything right. We kept the fire controlled. We kept gear close. We kept our flashlights ready. But none of that changes the fact that in those woods, you can only see what the light reaches, and everything beyond it belongs to the dark. Not long after full dark, the movement started. Heavy steps, slow and controlled, circling just outside the firelight. Not a rush, not a charge. Just a steady walk that made no attempt to hide the weight. The steps would pause, then resume from a different angle, like whatever it was didn't want to cross open ground, but wanted us to know it was there. It is easy to say later that it was probably just a big bear. The problem is that bears in those bottoms leave signs you can't miss. Claw marks, scat, torn logs, and a constant restless movement. What we felt was controlled. It didn't come to the fire for food. It didn't wander into light by mistake. It stayed right where it needed to be, and it let us do the worrying. The strangest part was how quiet it stayed otherwise. No snorts, no panting, no animal chatter. Just footfalls and the occasional soft brush of something moving through cane. When the steps stopped, the silence pressed down again, and you could hear the fire working in the ring like it was the only living thing in the clearing. At one point, we heard a second set of steps, farther back, matching the rhythm of the first. That's when it hit us that it might not be one thing. The timing felt coordinated. One presence would move while the other stayed still. Then they'd switch. It wasn't frantic. It was controlled. Nobody wanted to say what they were thinking. You can feel people running the same mental list. Bear, hog, person. But none of it fit. Bears don't circle camp like that without making noise and without trying to get food. Hogs don't move that slow and steady at the edge of light. People don't move in the dark without lights and without talking. In those woods, you learn not to force a story onto a sound. You hear a splash, and you don't call it a monster. You hear a thump, and you don't call it a ghost. You say what it most likely is, and you keep moving. That is how you stay calm and stay safe. The problem is that sometimes the most likely explanation doesn't match what your body is telling you. The smell hit again, stronger and closer. Wet dog mixed with swamp rot, thick enough to taste. It moved through the clearing like a wave, and for a moment it felt like it was right behind the fire ring, just beyond where the light ended. Then we heard something brush against a tree trunk. Not a claw scrape like a bear. More like a hand or forearm dragging, a slow contact sound that made the hair on your neck stand up. The tree was a few steps beyond the firelight, just a dark column against darker woods. At times, the woods felt like it was arranging us. We would choose a line that made sense and hit a deadfall that forced us to slow. We would skirt a patch of water, then find thicker cane where we didn't expect it. None of those things are impossible, but when they stack up during a day where the air already feels wrong, you stop calling them coincidence. We held still and listened. The steps shifted. Something moved from one side of camp to another without crossing in front of us. That shouldn't be possible if it was big. But the timing was too clean. It was like it knew how to use the shadows. Sometime after midnight, one presence came closer than the others. The steps were heavier, and they stopped nearer to camp. Not right at the edge, but close enough that if it took 2 steps forward, it would have been in the light. The pressure from that direction grew, not physical, but mental, like being stared at. One of us turned suddenly, and the beam of a flashlight caught a shape for a split second. What we saw in that instant was enough. A tall outline, upright, with shoulders too high and arms that seemed too long. The light hit it, and then it shifted backward, smooth and controlled, as if it had expected the beam. It didn't flinch like an animal. It didn't run like a man caught trespassing. It withdrew like something that knew it didn't need to hurry. The beam moved, searching, but there was nothing. The woods swallowed it. The silence returned so fast it felt staged. That second night, when the footsteps shifted position, it didn't sound like a single animal circling. It sounded like a handoff. One set would move while another stayed. Then the moving one would pause, and the other would pick up. That kind of pacing makes sense if there are 2 or more. It also makes sense if the goal is to watch from multiple angles without stepping into the open. After that, we stayed up, not in a frantic way, just in that stiff, alert posture where your body is tired, but your mind refuses to shut off. The footsteps continued, circling at a distance, sometimes fading, sometimes returning. No attack, no charge, just an ongoing presence, steady and patient. Right before dawn, it stopped. All of it, the steps, the smell, the pressure. It was like someone removed a weight from the clearing. The frogs didn't start back up, the insects didn't return, but the specific sense of being watched eased. A normal night has layers: frogs by the waterline, insects in the grass, an owl far back, a wind that moves the tops while the ground stays still. When those layers drop out, the world feels like it's missing its background. Your mind starts filling in the empty space with what could be there, and that's when fear grows. The strange part was that it didn't feel like imagination. It felt like the woods were choosing silence. When daylight finally came, the ground told the story. Around the edge of camp, in the soft mud and damp leaf litter, were tracks. Not a perfect line like a trail cam photo. Messy, overlapping, half-prints, but enough to see the pattern. The stride was too long for a person to make without running, and these weren't running prints. They were spaced like deliberate steps. Some prints showed toe impressions that didn't look like a boot tread, more like a wide foot with long front points. In a couple of spots, there were marks that looked like the ground had been pushed by the front of the foot, the way you see with something that walks with weight forward. The depth of the impressions said whatever made them was heavy. We did not hear snarls or growls. We did not hear the kind of animal warning that says it wants a fight. That absence was its own message. It did not need to posture. It did not need to bluff. The presence alone did the work. That's what made it feel like we were the ones trespassing, the ones who should be careful. We found hand impressions too, not claw marks. Actual pressure marks on tree bark where something had gripped, pressed, or steadied itself. On one tree, the bark was worn and smeared at a height that made no sense, well above where a man would reach without standing on something. The marks were not random scratches. They looked placed. We found that some gear had been moved again. A small item shifted a few inches. A strap laid differently. Nothing stolen. Nothing destroyed. It felt deliberate, like a test. Like it wanted to see how we reacted. That was enough. We didn't debate it. We decided to leave. Not after breakfast. Not after checking one more spot. Right then. Packing was fast, but still quiet. We didn't slam things. We didn't make a show. It felt wrong to act loud in that place. The woods had been quiet around us for 2 nights, and we were the only ones making noise. We kept it controlled and efficient. As we stepped out of the clearing and started the walk back, the pressure came back with us. Not the same as before. More like a boundary line moving beside us, keeping pace. We didn't hear steps close, but the sense of eyes stayed. In the morning, seeing the marks in daylight made it worse, not better. At night, you can blame fear for what you think you heard. In daylight, the ground shows what it shows. A bend in a sapling holds its shape. A smear on bark stays there. A deep impression in mud doesn't care if you want to explain it away. It becomes a fact that sits under your feet. The ground out of camp was a mix of firm leaf mat and soft pockets. In the soft pockets we saw where something had stepped and sunk deeper than it should. You could see the edges of a print in one spot and then nothing in the next, like whatever made it new where the ground would hold its weight without leaving a clean mark. That sounds strange to say, but hunters notice those patterns because we spend our lives reading where animals step. When we found pressed down grass and bent saplings, it wasn't the damage itself that bothered us. It was the placement. It sat around camp at angles that suggested someone had stopped and crouched, then shifted to another spot, at another. It looked like observation points. A hog would have made a mess in one area. A deer would have left light tracks. This looked like something moving with purpose. We also noticed that the usual hog sign along the edge of a slough was gone. Normally, you see torn-up mud and a stink of hogs hanging in the air. It wasn't there. The wallow looked unused, like the animals had avoided it for a few days. That was another small thing that made the bigger picture feel real. When the bottom land goes quiet, it isn't only people who notice. A little farther along, we found a section of cane pressed down in a straight band, like a heavy body had moved through it without zigzagging. Hogs push cane in messy arcs. Deer slip through with hardly a bend. This looked like a straight pass, shoulder width and tall enough to show the cane had been pushed aside at chest height. Even in daylight, that made our stomachs tighten. At one bend where the trail narrowed, we saw something on a tree trunk that looked like dried mud smeared high up. When we got closer, it wasn't mud. It was a dark smear with a greasy look, like wet fur had rubbed there repeatedly. The smell around that trunk was stronger too, the same wet dog and old water stench. It felt like a marker, like a boundary sign left in a way we didn't understand. We kept our pace steady and tried not to act like prey. That sounds silly, but there's a way you carry yourself when you don't want to invite a chase. You don't sprint and trip. You don't spin in circles. You move like you belong there, even when you don't feel that way. We held that posture because it was the only control we had left. The river bottoms have natural boundaries. A change in soil, a rise in ground, a shift from cane to hardwood. When we felt the pressure ease near those changes, it suggested a line, like the thing that watched us had a range it preferred not to cross. That matches the way territorial animals behave, but the way it did, it felt more like a person guarding a gate than an animal wandering a range. There were moments when the woods seemed to answer our movement. We would step over a log, and a few seconds later, a soft shift would happen off to the side, matching the time it would take something to reposition. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was like a quiet shadow changing lanes on a road, staying parallel, never passing. Twice we heard a low exhale from deeper cover. Not a snort, not a grunt, more like a slow breath pushed out through a long nose. It was one of those sounds you can't locate well because it doesn't have a sharp edge. But it carried enough that we all heard it. It made the hair on our arms rise because it sounded close and calm at the same time. We crossed a muddy strip where a beaver run cut through, and on the far side we found a set of impressions that looked like toe points in a line. Not like a deer hoof. Not like a hog split track. More like the front of a foot with long, narrow points. The print wasn't clean enough to call it with certainty, but the pattern repeated twice before the ground changed. It was just enough to make you stop thinking about boots and start thinking about feet. In one shaded pocket, we caught a quick movement high up, not in the canopy, but above the low brush. It wasn't a bird. It was too heavy and too smooth. A dark shape shifted behind a trunk, then stopped. When we aimed our eyes at it, it stayed still. When we looked away, it moved again. That kind of timing makes you feel foolish for even trying to explain it. We reached an old logging cut where the trees were younger and the ground was more open. The change should have felt safer. Instead, it made us feel exposed. In the thicker woods, at least you can pretend you're hidden too. In open ground, you know anything watching has an easier time seeing you, and your own eyes have fewer places to rest. Even after we left, the memory of the eyeshine stuck with us. It wasn't a bright animal reflection like you see from a deer. It was a dull, steady glint that seemed higher than it should be. And it didn't flicker as the head moved, because the head barely moved. It was a fixed point in the dark that made you feel measured. We were careful with scent, because hunters always are, but we weren't thinking about scent the way you do when you're being watched. That musky wet fur smell didn't behave like wind-carried swamp odor. It came and went in short bursts, like a living thing passing behind trees and then stepping into a gap in the cover. The smell felt close even when the sound felt distant, and that mismatch kept pulling at the nerves. The open cut had its own sign, a line of saplings bent inward at the edge, like something tall had leaned through to look. The bends were fresh. The leaves were still green at the breakpoints, not brown and dried. That meant it hadn't been done weeks ago. It had been done recently, and the angle suggested the weight came from above, not from a deer brushing past. Even in that open area, there was no normal noise. The bottom land stayed muted, like the whole region was holding back. That's what made the idea of a boundary feel real. It wasn't just that something was watching us. It was that everything else had adjusted around it, like smaller life knew to keep quiet until the big thing was satisfied. As we pushed on, the smell finally started fading for longer stretches. That alone eased the tension a little. Smell is one of those things that makes danger feel close, even if it isn't. When it went away, it felt like we were being allowed more space. That didn't make us relax completely, but it changed our breathing, changed the way our shoulders sat. Close to the edge of the deep bottom, we hit a stretch where the ground rose slightly and the trees thinned. The air moved there. A small breeze worked through the branches, and with it came normal sounds again, like distant birds and insects starting back up in a careful way. That contrast was sharp. It was like stepping out of a room where someone had been staring at you. We stopped once in that higher ground and listened. We didn't hear the footfalls anymore. We didn't feel the same pressure. It didn't mean the thing was gone. It meant the line had shifted behind us, and that was all we needed. The sense of being watched backed off the way a person backs off when they've made their point. Some people want a clean description: ears, teeth, a snout, claws. What we had was mostly outline and behavior, and in a way that's more believable. You don't get perfect views in river bottom woods at night. You get glimpses. You get the sense of size and the sense of intent. And you get the quiet, which can be louder than any scream when it comes all at once. Looking back toward the thicker woods, we could see only a wall of trunks and shadow. Nothing moved. Nothing showed itself. But the memory of how it had stood in the clearing stayed sharp. In a strange way, that was worse than an animal bolting. An animal runs because it's afraid. That thing withdrew because it decided to. We kept walking until the ground under our boots felt like normal again, until the air smelled like leaves and water instead of wet fur. Only then did we stop and really take stock. Our hands were shaking a little from the long tension. Not from cold, from the way your body holds stress when you try to stay quiet for hours. Later, when we got back to the trucks, the whole world sounded too loud. Engines, doors, gravel under tires. It was normal sound, but after 2 nights of that hard silence, it felt like a different planet. We didn't celebrate being out. We just sat for a minute and let our minds catch up to where our feet had already gone. Even then, nobody tried to make it a big story. We didn't laugh it off, and we didn't build it up. We just accepted that something had been in those woods with us, something we couldn't name cleanly, and that it had watched us the whole time. The river bottom canopy keeps light from doing what it does in open land. Even at noon, you can have pockets that look like evening. Shadows stay long, and the edges between dark and light are sharp. That gives anything hiding a better advantage than you want to admit. You might be 10 yards from something and never know it if it stands still and matches the background. We took the most direct route toward the place we'd entered, following game trails and old cuts, staying off the swamp edges where the ground could swallow sound. The air was cool and damp, and the tree canopy kept the light thin. Every so often, we'd catch a small shift in brush that stopped as soon as we looked. Mississippi bottom land has smells that stick to you. Sweet rot from leaves, sharp mud, cold water, and sometimes the iron smell of old decay where something died and fed the whole chain of life. Usually those smells feel normal. This time, the smell that came and went didn't blend. It sat on top of everything, like a wet animal that had been lying in the same place for days, then stood up and moved without sound. At one point, we crossed a narrow strip of mud near a slough, and we saw new impressions that hadn't been there on the way in. Deep, long prints on the far side, angled so they kept parallel to us. It wasn't blocking our path. It was shadowing it. We kept moving. We didn't run, because running in river-bottom woods makes noise and mistakes. We walked steady, heads up, checking the sides, not staring into one spot too long. The kind of movement you do when you want to show you're leaving, not challenging. Late in the morning, we reached a clearing where the trees opened up just enough for sunlight to reach the ground. A familiar place. We'd always used it as a waypoint, a spot to drink water and get bearings. We stopped there without meaning to, maybe because it was open and we could see a little farther. That's where we got the final confirmation. On the far side of the clearing, near the tree line, a shape stood motionless. This time the light was better. We were still too far for clean detail, but the outline was clear, tall, upright, shoulders high, head set forward. And the posture was not human. The legs looked bent wrong, like the weight was carried differently, and the arms hung low in a way that made it look built for power. In those woods, you judge distance by sound and by the way light hits the trunks. When the sound drops out, distance becomes guesswork. You can't tell if a step is 50 yards away or 100. You can't tell if the movement is in front or off to the side. That uncertainty is what makes you feel hunted, even when nothing is charging. It turns every pause into a question you can't answer. It didn't move closer. It didn't retreat. It just stood there, still as a stump, watching. And that's when you realize what being watched actually means. It wasn't curiosity from a deer. It wasn't the normal predator caution of a bobcat. It was focused. It felt like it understood we were leaving, and it wanted to make sure we did. Then it turned, slow and controlled, and slipped back into the trees. The motion was smooth, almost quiet enough to be unreal. The moment the shape was gone, the pressure eased, like we'd crossed a line it didn't care to cross. We kept moving after that, and didn't stop again until we were closer to the edge of that deep bottom land. And once we were out, once we hit more open ground, and could hear normal bird sounds again. It all felt unreal, like something that happened in a dream. We were not looking for anything legendary. We were looking for deer and hogs, the same as always. That's why the first upright shape hit so hard. It didn't fit the picture our minds had prepared, and it didn't behave like a startled animal. It didn't bolt. It didn't crash away. It stayed still long enough to be noticed, and moved away like it had planned the timing. But it wasn't a dream. The mud on our boots was real. The marks on the trees were real. The quiet was real. And the look of that shape at the tree line was real. For a while, nobody said much about it. Not out loud. People have a way of leaving things unspoken when the truth feels too heavy. We went back to our regular lives and told ourselves it was just a strange couple of nights, a run of bad luck, an animal acting odd. We kept noticing how clean the nights were. No random rustling, no squirrel chatter, no small things making mistakes. It was like the smaller life had made room for something bigger and smarter. That idea sounds dramatic until you've heard it. Until you've sat in a clearing with a fire and realized the fire is the only thing making noise besides your own breathing. But it didn't stay buried. The more time passed, the more those details sat in the mind. The unnatural stillness, the pacing footfalls, the way the thing withdrew instead of running, the way it moved our gear without taking it. That was not the behavior of a hungry animal. Eventually, we started using the word people use when they don't have a better one. Dogman. That's what folks call it around here when they want to. Talk about something upright, too big, too wrong, with a canine shape. We didn't start with that word in the woods. The woods didn't need a label. But later, trying to explain the feeling, the word came up. We didn't see its face clearly in the light, and I'll be honest about that. We saw outline, height, posture, and movement. But there were moments that hinted at more. A glint at the edge of the flashlight beam that looked like eyes set higher than a man's. A shadowed head shape. That felt longer in front, like a muzzle, not a flat face. And the smell wet fur and old water was strong enough to make you believe it had thick hair or hide. The thing that sticks with me most is the control. A bear that wants you gone will bluff, charge, or huff, or show itself big. A hog will crash and grunt and make a mess. A person will either call out or try not to be found at all. This presence did none of that. It showed enough to be known, then stayed just beyond reach. It circled without crossing. It watched without rushing. It felt territorial, like we were in its place, not the other way around. And it felt like it was measuring us, learning what we would do, deciding how much to show. The mud around the sloughs held prints the way soft clay does, and it gave away weight. You could tell when something heavy stepped there, because the impression stayed even after water seeped back in. In a couple spots, we saw where the ground had bulged at the edges of a print, like the foot pressed down hard and displaced everything around it. That kind of pressure wasn't from a deer or even a big hog. After that season, we stopped hunting that part of the river bottom. Not because we were scared of an attack. There was no attack. That's the honest truth. We were scared of what the presence meant. The idea that something that smart and that large could move in those woods without being seen unless it wanted to be. When people ask why we don't go back, I don't give them a big speech. I say the area changed. I say the game moved. I say the access got worse. All of that can be true in a practical way. But the real reason is simpler. We felt watched there in a way that didn't fit any animal we knew. The tree marks were especially hard to explain. We found strips of bark peeled down in long vertical lines, and the wood under it was fresh. Some of the strips started high, higher than a man would reach without climbing. The pattern didn't match antler rubs. It looked like something had dug in with nails and pulled down. The idea of hands did not feel crazy in that moment. It felt like the only shape that fit the evidence. Time doesn't make it go away either. You can be sitting at home in a lit room and still remember how the fire sounded too loud because everything else stopped. You can still remember the smell rolling in with no wind. You can still remember the way the shadow at the tree line didn't act like a shadow. What happened wasn't a movie moment. No screaming. No running into the dark. No hero moment. It was just a slow, believable shift from normal to wrong. And the scariest part was how patient it was. That patience told us it had the advantage the entire time. Looking back, the land itself feels different in my memory. Those Mississippi River bottom woods are beautiful, and they still are. But there are places in them where the quiet can turn heavy, where the air can feel held, and where you can feel eyes on you without seeing a single thing. One reason the upright shape felt wrong was the stillness. Animals have small movements even when they freeze. They shift ears. They flick tails. They adjust their weight. This shape held like a post, as if it didn't need to fidget. That kind of stillness reads as confidence. It reads like intelligence. It reads like something that knows you can see it and doesn't care until it decides it's time to move. That experience taught me something I didn't learn from any hunting lesson. It taught me that being watched is not the same as being hunted. Being hunted is loud. It is fast. It is chaotic. Being watched is calm. It is controlled. It is steady. And when something watches you like that, it means it can choose what happens next. We left because we felt that choice hanging over us like a weight, not as a threat spoken in words, but as a fact. It could have stepped into the firelight if it wanted. It could have closed the distance. It didn't. It held the line and let us understand we were the ones out of place. I still hunt in Mississippi. I still walk in the woods. I still love it the way I always have. But if the frogs go silent and the insects stop and the wind drops in a way that feels too sudden, I don't argue with it anymore. I pay attention because the woods are not empty. They never were. And somewhere down in those river bottom shadows, there is something that knows how to stand still and watch. It doesn't have to chase you to own the moment. It just has to let you feel it. That's what happened to us. That's why we left. And that's why we don't go back.